Alright, good evening again. This is round two with the blog responses, which will serve as the professional development response, at least for this event. For this one, I'll be focusing on three pieces again, this time from the Moving Writers website or blog. The first one was called, Behind the Scenes, Organizing the First Week, Semester, and Year. It's Not What You Think. This one was written by Allison Merchetti and published September 4th of this year, 2017. Let's see. So, getting into this one, she begins with a bit of a story, a bit of an anecdote about, you're sitting in a planning meeting and teachers are in the corner and they're looking through their planners, right? And they're looking at their lesson plans and you open yours and it's blank. And so her question is, what do you do? She centers in a lot of this site, what I've noticed is they center on the writing workshop model. And so she focuses a bit on that and talks about listening. And she says that your students always have the say in where you go with your lessons. You're always going to work to meet their needs. They're the primary goal here. It's student-centered. And so you're always pushing towards what the results of their tests tell you. And the question then becomes, well, if it's the first day and I haven't had time to summatively or formatively assess my students, what do I do with that? And so basically they say, well, you're not going to rely on what you did last year. You're not going to rely on even conversations. Sometimes you can rely on conversations with peers, I guess, but they say even the curriculum doesn't help. And so what she says is to start with activities that actually get you to know your students really quickly and really early in the semester. So while you don't have feedback from them to work with yet, you're creating assignments in the opening days of the class that give you the feedback. This blog in general is pretty simple, but this entry was also just very, very simplistic. At least it was very insightful. But what I noticed about this blog is pretty anecdotal. It just offers a few insights and it's really brief. So my reflection on this one will probably be much, much shorter than my last. There's a lot of packed verbiage there that I wanted to unpack in the last reflection. But here, they just say, focus on what the students can say, create assignments that allow you to get to know them, perhaps introduce them to one another, create a classroom community that way. And look for pieces and articles that relate to the real world and the topics you'll be discussing, so it shows the students very quickly that the assignments that you'll be asking them to do are relevant to today, are relevant to modern times, and also relevant to their personal lives. One of the quotes that I just have to share too is, as I mentioned before, the standards don't dictate what we teach any more than the clothes in my closet tell me what to wear each day. And they talk about, the author here talks about using standards as sort of a loose guideline. My real question here is, how does this attitude interact with standardized tests, state standards relating to teaching, the concept of merit pay, and all of these sort of criteria-based assessments that come with teaching. I would think it's implicit that what this author, what Allison is saying, is that you have to have that benchmark somewhere, and that's why you're responding to students in order to meet needs. Now, students aren't going to walk up to you and say, oh, well, I am struggling with this. I mean, sometimes they do, but not always, and not every student every day. And so what you're going to do is use your assessments and compare their personal academic growth to the standardized academic growth that you're supposed to be seeing in your classroom. At least that's what I would do. But she kind of dismisses standards a little bit here, and I think that's understandable, but I think it's not smart. I think, like I said, you need to use standards as a benchmark, and then use feedback from students formatively in order to help them understand exactly where you're aiming them. What I will say is that I really like the way she wraps this up and kind of encouraging teachers and telling them to have faith in themselves, that they know how to plan quickly and efficiently based on the needs that the assessments they use produce, the results show, I guess, for their students. So yes, there's the first piece, really focusing on planning and being student-centered in our approach to students. The second reading I'd like to address here actually is entitled Required Reading on Mandated Texts. So it's just a blogger's reflection on mandated texts. This was published September 22nd of this year by Jay Nickerson. And so we'll hop right into that. I've heard a lot since coming to IUSB about individuality of students. You want to embrace students' individuality, help them see their individuality, and help them, and you're catering to their needs. You're stretching them in the intelligences, Gardner's intelligences, that they're not very efficient in, and you're also playing to their strengths and allowing multiple means of assessment and multiple means of representation and all the UDL concepts. Jake challenges that a little bit here, and he actually comes out in very strong support of, assigning one novel to an entire class and saying this text is what we're going to read, this text is what we're going to study, and we're going to all do it together. I think there's a place for this. I do. I think it helps build classroom community, and going back to what we were talking about in the last post, it may, bring down that sort of individual success, me first mentality that we were talking about from the Washington Post video. But not only is he talking about assigning a book to an entire class, he's talking about what happens when a book is assigned to you as a teacher, and everyone says you will teach this, and then you have to take that assigned text, and so now you're being forced to teach it, and the students are being forced to learn it collectively. And he says his approach wouldn't really change that much. He said he'd embrace his freedom to plan. He has to teach a book, but he doesn't necessarily have to teach any particular lessons. And so he says he would sit down with that text and figure out the themes it suggests, or themes that I work with that would fit. And this really stood out to me, this particular quotation, because of its relationship to the Teaching with YA Lit book that I'm making my way through for the book clubs. It mimics the idea there from that book called either Finding the Themes Suggested by the Author, Finding Complexity in the Text, or Making Complexity. And so in terms of this particular teacher, in terms of Jay Nickerson, he's making complexity because he's seeing what themes are kind of in his wheelhouse and what he usually addresses in his English class, and seeing exactly how this book comments on them. This reading comes at a time for me that I'm really rediscovering literature. I've always been a storyteller, I've always been a writer, but not as much a reader. And throughout high school, I was kind of victim to those meaningless sort of chapter questions, and what color's the rabbit on page 45, and you read page 45 9 times and there's no rabbit on page 45, and you're like, how in the heck is this relevant to anything I'm doing, and how is it relevant to me, and how is it relevant to the book? They're basically checking if you read it. They're not letting you dig deep. And then when they let you dig deep, they say find 5 themes in this book, and they really don't give you much more direction than that. And so I don't think that leads to academic growth. It didn't for me. It doesn't lead to intellectual growth. It doesn't lead to critical thinking or diversity of opinion, or the conversations that come when people of differing views on a particular theme or subject, and I mean this in an academic sense, they argue with each other. And I think that is a really beautiful thing that some of these rote learning things, learning methods kind of neglect. And Nickerson here is really agreeing with that idea, and making complexity out of the novel by seeing what he usually teaches on to facilitate those conversations and pulling it out of those novels. Another thing he talks about is the intersection between teaching the themes, which we just addressed, and teaching the writing skills. And so you're pulling out themes, for example, from a book like my favorite, The Great Gatsby. So you'll have the theme of racism or sexism, or maybe not the isms there, but how race, sex, and then I was going to say classism or class affects the narrative. And so you're teaching those themes, but you're also teaching a skill. So obviously, not obviously, but you may choose to teach an argumentative writing lesson with a book like that, saying, you'll hand it a prompt that says something like, how does, or a descriptive prompt maybe, that says, how do these themes, or how does one of these themes appear in the novel? Is Daisy's position in that novel, for example, as an object of desire, is that something that is somewhat feminist because she is sort of worshipped by these men? Or is it patriarchal in saying that no, they just want her to control her and she doesn't really have a whole lot of agency? And so you engage these themes in an argumentative way. And so in this blog post, what Jay is doing is saying that the writing skill intersects with the themes and the analytical reading skill that you're doing. So you're doing literary analysis, and you're also teaching a particular writing skill. That also reminds me from the argumentative writing book I read for the book club, what they called, I believe, descriptive knowledge versus process knowledge. So they could describe something, but they couldn't produce it. And so here you're being able to describe things, you're being able to identify things, not only in the themes of a text, but in the craft of a text. And then you're able to produce the document asked of you in relation to that text. So that is blog number 2. Again, that was the behind the scenes piece by Allison Marchetti. And if you would like to read that yourself, I believe it's the second link down on the notes page, which is probably attached to where you got these links. If not, let me know. I'll hook you up with that. So number 3, it was a post written by Stephanie Jochman, Jochman. And it says, organizing to communicate. Open the door of your writing workshop to school families. It was published on the 19th of September. And I'll be honest with you, this post, so far of the ones I've reviewed, was my least favorite. I was really excited because I thought that this post would probably address the idea of using English to engage community issues, helping students understand that reading and writing are skills that are used in the everyday world, in everyday life. And I assumed that what this piece was doing was inviting parents to take place in that writing process, to take place in engagement in those conversations, and including students in important community conversations and important conversations within the family. It didn't. For lack of a better term, it didn't. I was really disappointed. Talks a lot about defending the writing workshop model. I'm not as familiar with that. From what I've been able to gather from these blog posts, it seems interesting. It seems student-centered. It seems, the best part of this blog kind of explains where the rigor comes from in a writing workshop mentality. And so I think what writing workshop tends to do is basically just have students write and revise. And what they're arguing is that in the workshop model, students are sort of picking their own subjects and working kind of at their own pace, and so some parents are skeptical about the rigor there, and that's certainly something that I would want to defend, because I'm not familiar with the actual term writing workshop and what that entails for especially a high school audience. But it does seem to give more agency and ownership to the students, the workshop model does, and so if you can do that and still teach the skills and the skills necessary and the content necessary to meet the specific academic standards that the students will soon be asked to be tested on, especially if it's 9th or 10th grade, or if it's heading towards senior year in the SATs, I think it's great. The workshop model itself, from what I've been able to gather, just because it's student-centered, if they are personally engaged and see that they have a personal stake in their writing and see that it's relevant to their community and that the skill of writing and reading, communicating and reading implicitly into other people's texts so they understand exactly what people are trying to do when people are trying to manipulate them, when people are communicating with them. Reading and writing, to me, is an invaluable skill. What they really do in this post, though, is kind of present you with a script of this is how to defend writing workshop, and I think I've done a better job in this video defending it than they did in the article, and so I was really disappointed because they just sort of write a script about look at me and look at my research, and I'm not going to take into account what the parents have to say because I'm a teacher and I'm going to be a dick. And it just came off very pompous to me, and I guess I just disagree. I know what they're trying to defend. That's what I'm trying to defend, but I really don't understand exactly what the point of this post was. It didn't seem really, other than sending home an editing checklist to parents or to peer review forums, which probably just include editing checklists. It didn't seem that they were really inviting parents into the process. It seemed like they were defending their practices because they're avant-garde. And if you need to defend your practices, I don't know. I don't think it needs to be a competition or it needs to be hostile. And that's what this teacher seems to be suggesting is, oh, I'm scared of parents. I'm scared of engaging parents. I turn into my first-year teacher, is what she said in the article. My first-year self of teaching. And I'm not intimidated by that, so I don't relate to that. To me, I have faith in what I'll be teaching. I have faith in my own abilities. I have faith in my students' abilities to produce what they need to produce. And I have faith in their parents to understand the necessity of that. And if they don't, that's a conversation to be had, but I certainly wouldn't come in swinging with a script and look at my research and I'm going to quote a doctor and, run intellectual circles around you. That's the last thing I would want to do for a parent who's concerned about the intellectual well-being of their child. I would want to defend it with kindness and explain, the reasons why we're doing it and not just say, oh, look at me, I can defend myself, but rather say, what we're doing is changing the model of education, but what that actually does is benefit your child. And so that's what I would rather suggest. What we'll get into the next video does begin to appear here, which is the emphasis on the editing process in the writing workshop model. And so there will be an upcoming video that talks a lot about editing and voice, and so just keep a lookout for that. But for now, I'll call it quits on this. Again, this was the review of the Moving Writers blog pieces. And that's it. Let me know if you need anything else, Professor.